When Harold Felton saw a stranger wearing the bracelet he'd gifted to his missing daughter, his world shattered. In trying to get her back, he had to face painful secrets and confront the reality that his wealth might have become a curse to her. What followed would shock even the most worldly of observers. But let's start from the beginning. Harold Felton was a man of iron will and unwavering principles, and his approach to life could be described as almost ascetic, despite being one of the wealthiest men in his county. His home, a grand mansion, was immersed in luxury, but Harold himself didn't seek out the pleasures money could bring. He viewed his wealth not as a source of personal happiness, but as a tool to be used sparingly and purposefully. To him, wealth was like a knife. It could protect or harm, depending on how it was wielded. With this philosophy, he raised his only daughter, Amelia, showering her with paternal care but never indulging her with boundless freedom. From early childhood, Amelia was conditioned to follow a strict schedule and fulfill her responsibilities, which her father never allowed her to disregard. He saw no reason why a wealthy heiress should live differently from the children of regular families, and thus, even simple entertainments were often forbidden. Her days were filled with lessons and obligations, every achievement scrutinized, and every misstep quickly noticed. Yet amid these limitations and her father's often intimidating strictness, Amelia always sensed Harold's genuine care for her. However, his concern felt veiled. Every demand concealed a deep, rarely expressed fatherly love. Her 18th birthday was a significant milestone, not just for Amelia, but for Harold as well. He had spent a long time thinking about how to mark the day, sensing it was time to acknowledge her as an adult. He wanted her to understand that his demands had been aimed solely at instilling strength of character. For that reason, when her birthday arrived, Harold did something Amelia could never have expected. He took an antique bracelet from his jewelry collection, one that had once belonged to her mother. This bracelet was arguably his most prized possession, after Amelia herself. Its sapphires were a deep blue, like stormy skies, while its diamonds shimmered like tiny stars. Harold had kept it in a prominent place in his collection, but no one had ever been allowed to touch it. To Harold, the bracelet symbolized his love for his wife, her memory, and the brief happiness they'd shared before she passed away. Amelia had been very young when her mother died, so Harold had hesitated to give her the bracelet right away. He wanted to wait until she was old enough to understand its full value and significance. When he handed the bracelet to his daughter, Harold felt a peculiar excitement he hadn't experienced in years. He thought about how the bracelet embodied not just precious stones and metals, but all his memories, love and tenderness, that he might have never been able to communicate to Amelia in words. As she took the bracelet in her hands, Amelia noticed her father's subtle tremor and a warmth in his gaze that was more open than ever before. Harold spoke of her mother, of how they'd picked out the bracelet together in Paris, how it had become a symbol of their love, and how he hoped it would now accompany her through life. He asked Amelia to guard the bracelet as she would her own honor, reminding her that it represented not just her roots, but also the legacy she'd one day be entrusted to carry on. Amelia struggled to hold back tears as she listened to her father, and it seemed as if, for the first time, she saw him not just as a strict mentor, but as a man who had lost the one he loved most and had preserved her memory all these years for their daughter's sake. Harold, in turn, saw a light in her eyes that he hadn't seen in a long time, and this gave him hope that their relationship would grow warmer, that he could now trust her and her decisions more. In passing on the bracelet, Harold conveyed everything he couldn't say with words: his hopes, his fears, his wish for Amelia to know that she was not just his daughter, but his most cherished part. He left the room, leaving Amelia alone with the bracelet, understanding that she was now beginning her own journey, one that might be difficult and full of trials. But he believed that by keeping this bracelet, she'd always remember that he was there to support her. Several years had passed since Harold Felton had given Amelia the treasured bracelet, and their relationship seemed to have grown warmer. Now a young woman, confident in her choices, Amelia occasionally left home, made new friends, and gradually gained the independence Harold viewed with a mix of pride and concern. though he still tried to monitor her every step. He knew that his strict principles might one day drive her away, but he held on to the hope that she valued the care underlying his demands. But one day, Harold's world came crashing down. Amelia vanished without a word. At first he thought it must be a mistake. Maybe she had gone to visit friends or decided to spend time somewhere secluded. But she didn't return the next day or the next week. With growing alarm, Harold mobilized all his employees and friends to search for her, refusing to accept that she might not be safe. He contacted private detectives, hired top specialists to trace her last known movements. Days turned to weeks, and weeks to months, but no news ever came. Each morning, Harold waited for any word, sitting in his study, staring at the phone and flinching at every ring, hoping to hear her voice. Every evening, as the day ended and no calls came, he would climb the stairs, enter her room, which remained untouched and orderly, just as Amelia had always kept it. Her textbooks lay neatly arranged on her desk, as if she'd just stepped out and would be back any moment. Rumors of her disappearance spread swiftly. People speculated she'd been kidnapped, or perhaps someone was using her as leverage against Harold, to take his money or exact revenge. Some suggested she might have left on her own, simply tired of endless restrictions and expectations. Whispers about how the wealthy also suffer and how Harold might have been too strict, not allowing his daughter to live her life freely, cut deeply. These rumors gnawed at him, filling him with guilt for being too demanding, too harsh, perhaps not loving enough. Days turned into months, and Harold could no longer bring himself to meet with friends or conduct his business with the same zeal. All his wealth and successes seemed meaningless without Amelia. He spent vast sums, enlisted powerful people, and searched for her in every corner of the country and beyond. Millions went to private investigators, advanced tracking technologies, but to no avail. Harold, a man who'd always found a way, was powerless against the silent void into which his daughter seemed to have vanished. Amelia's room became a sanctuary for him, a place to remember her, every detail and object she'd left in its place. Books lined the shelves, her favorite dresses hung in the closet, and on her desk lay the very bracelet he'd given her for her 18th birthday, a lone reminder of their former happiness. Sometimes he locked himself in the room for hours, pondering what mistakes he might have made, what he might have overlooked, how he could have let her disappearance turn his life into a void. Each time he left, Harold left the room undisturbed, as if afraid that altering anything might erase traces of Amelia from his memory. In his heart settled a constant sense of guilt, a private tragedy he could share with no one. This was his secret penance, the feeling that he might not have done everything he could, that he hadn't shown enough flexibility or love. 20 long years passed. Harold Felton had changed drastically. His once confident, steady gaze was now filled with sadness and fatigue. He hardly smiled anymore and rarely appeared in public. Those who remembered him as vibrant and driven noted how time and an invisible weight seemed to be slowly draining the life from him. Harold attended fewer social events that used to be a routine part of his life. But that evening, he accepted an invitation. A longtime friend was celebrating an anniversary at one of the city's finest restaurants, and Harold, perhaps, simply couldn't find the strength to decline. Once among people, Harold felt out of place. He was surrounded by endless conversations about wealth, success, and new acquisitions, all topics that once had been his element, but now seemed meaningless. Sitting at the table, he barely engaged in the conversation, replying mechanically to polite questions, his thoughts drifting back to his lost daughter. Amelia's face, her room, and that bracelet still haunted him, even after all these years. He had almost accepted that he would never find the answers he sought. Then, just as Harold was about to leave without waiting for the evening to end, something caught his eye. Sitting at a nearby table was a middle-aged woman, seemingly ordinary in appearance. She wore a simple dress, her hair was tied back in a casual bun, and her makeup was minimal, as if she didn't care about making an impression. But it wasn't her appearance that drew Harold's attention. On her wrist, he noticed the familiar sparkle of sapphires and diamonds, the bracelet he had given to Amelia 20 years ago. The very bracelet that symbolized his love and memory, as if it were cloaked in his own soul. At first he couldn't believe his eyes. It seemed impossible that the bracelet he had desperately searched for could suddenly appear in such an unexpected place, worn by a complete stranger. Harold froze, his heart pounding. He even felt the blood drain from his face, leaving him cold and numb. He was paralyzed by either fear or a sudden surge of hope. Memories flashed before his eyes. The day he had given the bracelet to Amelia, her joyful gaze, her laughter. He could barely breathe as he watched the sapphires glimmer in the candlelight, just as they had in a distant past. Unable to bear the tension, Harold slowly stood and resolutely walked toward the woman. He didn't want to appear rude or intrusive, but he simply couldn't let this chance slip by. He couldn't allow this stranger to leave without getting answers. As he approached, he took a deep breath and, trying to speak calmly, politely addressed her. His voice trembled with an aching sadness that had been repressed for 20 years. He could barely bring himself to say, "Pardon me for interrupting, but I have to ask, where did you get that bracelet?" The woman, surprised by his question, looked up at him with confusion, as if she didn't understand why her piece of jewelry had suddenly drawn so much attention. She gave a slight smile and, meeting Harold's gaze, explained that the bracelet had come from her ex-husband. She said that years ago he had given it to her, claiming it had belonged to his mother, though he never mentioned any other details. The woman's words struck Harold like lightning. Her ex-husband? His mother? Who was this man, and how did he come to have the bracelet? Harold felt old wounds he thought had healed begin to ache anew. As Harold listened to Martha, each word cut through him like the reopening of an old scar. He watched her casually describe the bracelet as a simple family heirloom, unaware that for him, it embodied everything left of his daughter. Martha explained that she had received the bracelet from her ex-husband many years ago. He had claimed it was a family piece from his mother and had urged her to wear it as it held profound, almost sacred meaning for him. Harold, unable to tear his eyes from the bracelet, asked if she knew where her ex-husband was now. But Martha sighed, admitting that she had long since lost touch. They'd parted ways due to irreconcilable issues, and their paths, as far as she knew, had diverged permanently. Her voice was calm, but for Harold, each word amplified the turmoil inside him, as if someone were carefully unfolding the pages of a nightmare that had now become his reality. When she finished, Harold realized he could no longer keep his suspicions at bay. Fragments of thoughts started to piece together in his mind, thoughts both disturbing and strangely captivating. He knew that his only hope of finding answers was to discover who this man was, the one who had given Martha the bracelet that had once belonged to Amelia. He needed the truth, no matter how painful. The very next day, Harold hired private investigators, arming them with everything they could possibly need. Martha's photograph, details of her story, and every small piece of information she had shared. The investigators set to work, and Harold spent the week in agonizing anticipation, unable to find peace. He rarely slept, barely ate, and distanced himself from everyone, preferring solitude where nothing could distract him from the process. He almost lived in his study, replaying his conversation with Martha over and over, hoping the answers would soon become clear. A week passed. Late one evening, just as he was beginning to believe that hope was slipping away again, one of the detectives called. Harold answered, and the words he had both dreaded and craved to hear rang out in his ears. "Sir, we have shocking information," said the detective, his voice tinged with tension. "Martha's ex-husband is in fact your daughter, Amelia. She changed her name and has hidden her identity all these years. We don't know the full reasons, but she has been living under a male alias, keeping herself out of your sight." Harold froze, as if the world around him had come to a standstill. Amelia, his daughter, whom he had thought lost forever, hadn't vanished. She had simply become someone else, escaping the life he'd crafted for her and the pressure he had unknowingly imposed. Her secret had been hidden from him for nearly his entire life. Harold lowered the phone, his gaze blank. His entire life unraveled before him like a house of cards, built on false expectations, unyielding discipline, and a love he had never been able to fully express. Now he realized that his relentless expectations, control, and attempts to shape her life according to his ideals, had driven Amelia to such darkness that her only escape was to reject herself entirely. The detective's findings shattered Harold to his core. He, a man who had considered his principles his anchor and purpose, suddenly understood that these very principles had severed his connection with his only daughter. He could see now that his demands and desire to mold Amelia's life had not strengthened her, as he had believed. Instead, they had pushed her so far away that she chose to disappear and ultimately reject her very identity to break free of the image he had built for her. An internal struggle erupted within him, and haunting questions with no answers echoed in his mind. Was he truly right to raise her so rigidly, or had his devotion to discipline turned into a curse for them both? Was his wealth, which he had always viewed as a tool for creating a better life, the very burden Amelia had tried to escape? Was he responsible for her fate, for her choice to become someone else in order to finally find freedom? These thoughts consumed him, and Harold felt that the life he had built over the years had lost all meaning. His home, once brimming with energy, was now empty and somber. The grand halls, the priceless paintings, and the antique furniture he'd so valued felt hollow and lifeless. Harold could no longer endure the loneliness and emptiness that had taken hold of his soul. And so, one morning, he made a decision that, in the past, he would have dismissed with disdain. Leaving his wealth and affairs in the hands of trusted associates, Harold set off on a journey across America to find Amelia. He had no idea where to begin or how it would end, but he had to believe he was doing all he could to atone, both to her and to himself. This journey was not just a search for his lost daughter. It was an act of redemption, a chance to break free from the pride and rigid principles that had bound him for so long. At first, he traveled from town to town where she might have been. He spoke with people he met, sharing his story and showing them an old photograph of Amelia from before her disappearance. He stayed in modest motels, at bus stations, eating in diners he would never have considered before. Day by day, Harold felt himself undergo a profound transformation. He began to see life differently, not through the lens of wealth and status, but through simple things he discovered in people, in their kindness and sincerity. Every new encounter was a lesson. He watched the lives of people he would never have crossed paths with before, and saw in their simplicity the very values he had once deemed unworthy. It was a kind of purification for him. Harold started to understand that the true meaning of life wasn't about maintaining control, but about letting everyone walk their own path. One day, he stopped in front of a mirror in a cheap hotel and was startled to see that he looked older, gentler, like a man who had finally let go of a part of the burden weighing down his heart. Months passed as he wondered, until one day, in a small town, he met a woman who recognized Amelia from the photo. She told Harold she had seen her recently in a neighboring state, describing her as an independent, intelligent, but reserved person who rarely spoke to strangers. Hearing this, Harold felt a mixture of pain and relief. Pain at how much his daughter had changed, and relief that he had finally found some trace of her. Following her directions and clinging to hope, Harold finally found the house where Amelia was living. Standing before her door, he felt a strange anticipation, as though he was about to meet not his daughter, but a completely new person he had yet to know. At last the door opened, and there stood Amelia, older, changed, yet unmistakably his daughter. They stood in silence, looking at each other, and Harold understood that though years had passed, her eyes still held the warmth and life he had once tried to suppress. In that quiet moment, he realized that their future depended on one thing alone: whether he could forgive himself and start anew, with genuine, unconditional love and support. Standing there facing Amelia, he knew he had found not only her, but a part of himself he had long lost.